Now, the Eurovision Song Contest is in its biggest ever crisis, and that's because multiple broadcasters across member states have withdrawn because of the inclusion of Israel, a state which has and is committing genocide against the Palestinian people. This is big. The likes of Spain, Ireland, we'll talk about them, other European nations who have said that because Israel is being included once again after committing a live stream genocide, they are pulling the plug. Now, that puts massive pressure on other countries, and we'll see. In fact, we'll talk about this. Other countries may soon follow suit. And in those countries which continue to participate, there's going to be massive uproar about this continued participation. Now, we've got a lot to talk about here, why this is so important. You know, some will go, oh, it's a big camp frothy music thing. Why does it matter? It matters a lot. We'll talk about that. As well as the usual arguments you hear against this and what happens next. Now, there's no better person to speak to about this than Samir Eskanda, who is a Palestinian-Irish artist, organizer, human rights activist, who's involved with the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. We'll talk about that. It's a hugely important movement modeled on the anti-apartheid movement, which obviously was pivotal in overthrowing the apartheid regime in South Africa. Samir, it's great to speak to you. How you doing?
I'm okay. Hi, Owen.
Great to speak to you as always. I just want to start actually with first principles because, you know, some people might go, you know, might be confused about this. They might go, well, isn't it just a music festival? I saw Fraser Nelson, who's a British journalist, who said, Eurovision's about the people, not about governments, basically saying, why is politics involved in all of this? What's the response to that? That's the main argument you hear, you know, thrown against the likes of various countries now withdrawing.
Well, the fact is that Israel desperately needs Eurovision to whitewash its, as you said, ongoing genocide in Gaza, and in fact, its 77-year-old regime of settler colonial apartheid against the entire Palestinian people. Actually, Israeli media has reported that the Israeli president was deeply involved behind the scenes in pressuring European broadcasters to not vote in favor of genocidal Israel's exclusion from Eurovision. Most likely, the Israeli president and his team was threatening these broadcasters, since that's Israel's typical method. We've seen leading genocidal Israeli politicians publicly welcoming its inclusion in Eurovision, condemning the Eurovision members who are boycotting the festival now. The president of the Spanish broadcaster, which is one of those who've withdrawn, has called the supposedly democratic Eurovision vote that took place a few days ago, he's called it a farce, cooked up in back rooms. And of course, what's very important to mention is that Russia was banned in February 2022 and is still banned. But this took place literally within hours of its illegal invasion of Ukraine. Within hours, Russia was banned from Eurovision. But here we are, more than 2 years into a live stream genocide in Gaza, 8 decades into Israel's ethnic cleansing and apartheid against Palestinians, and still it can participate in the world's biggest live music event. It is absolutely shameful.
And I mean, to be clear, you know, a consensus of genocide scholars have concluded that Israel has committed genocide, including Israeli genocide scholars and Israeli human rights organizations. But Palestinians, of course, said this from the very beginning. Their voice is obviously not listened to. The UN Independent Commission concluded it's genocide. And countries which have now withdrawn, like Spain, Ireland, have said that this is genocide. It's obviously a genocide. I mean, in terms of what's actually happening now as well, because you said this is an ongoing genocide. And this argument is, well, there's a ceasefire now. Donald Trump, the great peacemaker, has come to the rescue. He said he's ended a thousands-year-long conflict, as he puts it. Peace now prevails. So now we can just normalize Israel and everyone can just get on watching a music contest. What do you say when people say things like that?
Well, I think it's very clear to most of humanity that there is no ceasefire in Gaza. Israel is continuing to murder, besiege, and starve 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza. And in any case, it has already systematically destroyed the necessary conditions for sustaining life. We're talking about hospitals, food production, water treatment, and other basic services have been completely obliterated by Israel. Hundreds of Palestinian journalists and media workers have been targeted and killed. And this is of particular relevance for the European Broadcasting Union, which organizes Eurovision too. You would have thought there would be solidarity from European journalists for their Palestinian counterparts who have suffered what people are calling a genocide within the genocide in Gaza. But as you mentioned, the US and Israel's so-called peace plan for Gaza is colonial, it's genocidal, and it's illegal. It's actually about continuing the genocide in less visible forms that might, they hope, provoke less outrage. But as I said, the global majority is not buying it. Trump actually told Israel, you cannot fight the world because the world wins. And that world is us. It's the meaningful grassroots pressure that the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement has led over the past 2 decades. Even Netanyahu has admitted that Israel is isolated. And it is true that at the grassroots and civil society levels all over the world, apartheid Israel is more isolated than ever because of the impact of the BDS movement. I can give you a few examples. In terms of the cultural boycott of Israel, since the start of this ongoing live stream genocide, the Palestinian-led grassroots BDS movement has initiated and supported many campaigns that demand the end of complicity as a contribution towards bringing our liberation nearer. So a few examples from the cultural boycott: roughly 2,000 arts organizations around the world have endorsed the cultural boycott of Israel, and tens of thousands of individual artists. The Eurovision is the world's largest live music event. The world's largest documentary festival is IDFA, the International Documentary Festival of Amsterdam, and it's recently endorsed the cultural boycott of Israel and its complicit institutions, among hundreds of other European arts organizations and institutions. Another example, the No Music for Genocide campaign. We've seen there over 1,000 artists and labels remove their music from being streamed in apartheid Israel. Those artists include Denzel Curry, Lorde, and also Bjork, who's also recently and publicly called on the Icelandic broadcaster to also withdraw from Eurovision. Another example, Film Workers for Palestine has led a pledge signed ultimately by more than 5,000 film and TV workers, including many leading Hollywood figures, who are all refusing to work with complicit Israeli film institutions and companies. All of this is part of a global push for accountability. Now, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement is a non-violent anti-racist movement, and it's all about ending complicity. The reason is complicity, especially in the West, enables and sustains Israel's oppression against Palestinians. And this is exactly why, for more than 2 decades, Palestinians have been demanding the end of complicity with genocidal Israel. And indeed, many states, corporations, and institutions, including in music and the arts, have not yet ended their complicity. I think that this escalating boycott of Eurovision shows the growing strength and impact of the BDS network all across Europe. We've seen incredible and very creative civil society pressure at so many different levels in so many different European countries. Actually, the BDS movement has been campaigning on Eurovision since 2018, when Israel actually won, most likely by rigging the vote, as it did in 2025, which we all know for sure now. This ongoing campaign since 2018 is part of the BDS overall theory of change. It's a grassroots to grass tips strategy. We start with the grassroots, but we never stop building out from there. What we're doing is gradually, sustainably, and intersectionally building the people power we need to isolate and dismantle Israel's entire regime of oppression. And we are starting to see the S in BDS, which is sanctions. We're starting to see targeted, lawful, people-powered sanctions. We're seeing military embargoes, energy bans, and we're seeing blocking of ships and other examples. The fact is, BDS works because it is a global grassroots movement that is the most effective strategy of solidarity with the Palestinian liberation struggle. And it comes in a very long tradition of Palestinian popular resistance to oppression, including civil disobedience, cultural resistance, and boycotts.
And on this, because I mean, that partly answers, again, this is because I want to talk as well about, the fact Spain, and we'll go on to that, the significance of them pulling out, which is massive. And because you get this response of, oh, whoa, is it people boycotting Eurovision? How's that going to end the genocide? How's this going to end all these horrors? And this was the argument that was at the time levied again against the cultural boycott of South Africa under apartheid. And some bands and musicians refused to they refused to abide by their boycott. That included the Beach Boys, Frank Sinatra, and Queen. Brian May, who I believe is very apologetic about this now, said at the time, the band is not political. We play to anybody who wants to come and listen. That's after Queen performed at the Sun City luxury resort in apartheid South Africa. So what's the argument? Because we look back at a lot of people now understand with the anti-apartheid movement that it wasn't one thing that brought down apartheid. It's that you get it's the aggregate. How would you explain that today with this? Why this is part and parcel of an overall strategy?
Well, I think that artists and cultural workers have a particular ethical responsibility to not allow their art, their music, their writing to become complicit, either inadvertently or otherwise, in art washing, genocide, apartheid, military occupation, and ethnic cleansing. This is an absolute moral necessity. Now, many artists have realized this before Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza. Since then, we've seen how many others have also recognized this responsibility. I think in the case of apartheid South Africa, it's one of those cases where everybody now says they supported it at the time. There are very, very few who would still insist that that was wrong or that they didn't participate. And we could draw an analogy here. As a movement, I think we have to be able to welcome people in who can people and institutions that can correct or compensate for prior wrongs. I think it's possible for people to admit an error and to make up for it by joining and participating in a movement. In the case of Queen, they actually played apartheid Israel a number of years ago as well. Of course, with a different singer. I think that history won't look kindly upon those who cross the Palestinian picket line today. I would also talk here about how European broadcasters are not just complicit through their participation in Eurovision alongside apartheid Israel as if it's normal. They're also complicit with their very often biased reporting that has obscured the facts of Israel's genocide and its overall regime of apartheid. So on one hand, they're covering up this genocide, and then on the other hand, they're participating with Israel and acting like everything's normal. As you said, commentators, Eurovision experts, they're calling this an existential crisis for Eurovision. The BBC, which is, along with the New York Times, perhaps the most genocidal of all Western media outlets, it's calling this the most severe crisis in the contest's history. We've got 7 Eurovision winners now calling for Israel to be excluded. One of those is Johnny Logan. He won 3 times for Ireland. Another is Salvador Sobral. He won in 2017 for Portugal. And yet another, JJ, won for Austria in 2025. Those 7 winners are among well over 70 former Eurovision contestants calling for Israel to be excluded, along with thousands of other artists. I think the question is, how far are Eurovision organizers, the EBU, prepared to go to protect genocidal Israel from accountability and to potentially destroy the contest in the process? And Europe's record on this is not good, to say the least. Another thing that's worth pointing to, I think, is that fans of Eurovision are absolutely devastated, and many of them are acting on principle. So what I'm seeing is a lot of fan sites are closing en masse. These are, these are groups that are set up to, analyze every detail about Eurovision and so on. They're just closing it down because they don't want to have any involvement in promoting, even indirectly, genocidal Israel. They are utterly heartbroken that the EBU is prepared to destroy the contest's reputation for Israel. And of course, for many queer and trans people, Eurovision is a meaningful event, but its fans, the fans of Eurovision, are abandoning it over Israel's inclusion. And it's also important, I think, to mention they're taking this stance while multiple levels of attacks are being made against queer and trans rights from many European states, including Britain. So these fans are recognizing that at a time of rising fascism and racism and assaults on all of our rights, in fact, relentlessly pursuing accountability for the perpetrators of genocide and all of their accomplices, and demanding the end of impunity for them is an essential priority for humanity. Because if Israel gets away with this live stream genocide and is not held to account, then who will be safe in future?
Now, I mean, in terms of just the countries that have pulled out, Spain, Ireland, Netherlands, Slovenia, Belgium, in protest of the inclusion of Israel, how did that come about, and how significant is it?
Um, Belgium hasn't pulled out. I think
Oh, Belgium hasn't. Sorry, take that
no,
back.
so the thing with Belgium is because it has two official languages, it has two broadcasters, and I believe they take turns. And so one of them isn't participating this year anyway. But that is a question that I've been looking at over the last few days. That's my current understanding. As of the time of speaking, there are four broadcasters that have pulled out. It's Spain, which is one of the big five, which is the five European countries that contribute the most financially and basically control Eurovision. You have Ireland, which holds the record for the joint number of wins. That's also withdrawn. And as you said, Slovenia and the Netherlands. We've seen in the Netherlands, by the way, hundreds of arts organizations and thousands of individual artists join a pledge supporting the cultural boycott of Israel in both the Netherlands and Belgium. It was a joint pledge. And I think alongside that, because we've seen so many different civil society actions and forms of very strategic and principled pressure, I think these are the factors that have contributed to these broadcasters, many of whom, to varying extents, as I said, have been complicit in covering up through biased reporting the real facts of the genocide. And yet here we're seeing them withdraw from the world's biggest live music contest in order to not participate alongside genocidal Israel. So how did we get here? The answer really is this incredible form of strategic BDS pressure we've seen in many, many places.
I mean, because obviously this is significant in its own terms. I mean, as you say, Spain's one of the main funders of Eurovision. But what does that mean now for those countries, including Britain, which are still participating? I mean, because this was already, huge controversy last year in many of these countries when they participated. But this brings us to a whole new level, surely.
I think we're going to see increased pressure on all these broadcasters. So whether this is the Portuguese RTP or it's the British BBC or the Belgian and many, many others, we're going to see how pressure from fans, first and foremost, really the outrage from fans who love this contest. I mean, it's the most watched live music event. A lot of people either watch it live or they follow it on social media or both. We're going to see that this heartbreak, this outrage is going to be channeled into different types of public pressure and some types of private pressure too, I imagine. And meanwhile, it's not just going to be the broadcasters that see these kind of appeals. It's also going to be the contestants, whether this is the national selection contestants. Some countries hold national selection competitions in order to choose their contestant. Others just kind of handpick them. I think that's what the BBC does, taking no chances now. And not to be too cynical, but I wouldn't be surprised if the countries who handpick behind the scenes their finalists, they're most likely, in my view, going to pick people who they believe are going to be least likely to be receptive to moral appeals and other forms of pressure in order to encourage them to withdraw and boycott the contest. But we're going to see pressure on the national selection contestants, on the finalists. We're going to see presenters withdrawing, most likely commentators. We're going to see actions from crew. The reason I think this is very likely is because we've seen this in previous years. In 2025, in 2024, and in 2019, when it was held in apartheid Israel, we've really seen all those different kinds of actions. For example, I believe it was 2024 and again in 2025, if I'm not mistaken, TV workers in Belgium kind of took over the screen and screened a message of solidarity with Palestinians. Some presenters have been very publicly boycotting Eurovision, refusing to commentate on it. Others have just kind of quietly or silently slipped away. And we as the BDS movement more broadly would would welcome that too. The silent boycott is huge, by the way. For every individual or artist who is comfortable enough publicly declaring their support for the cultural boycott of Israel, I think there are several others who are more comfortable doing so quietly for now. And while we hope, of course, that all of those folks involved in a silent boycott do come out publicly, at the same time, this also helps. So because we've seen this before, and now because we have this far greater momentum with actual public state broadcasters boycotting Eurovision, which is kind of giving it that kind of state level, that pseudo state level stamp of approval for this campaign that the BDS movement has been working on for many years, as I said, I think that's going to give real momentum to other withdrawals.
Just a couple of other things. I mean, you mentioned obviously this is about queer rights, for example, LGBTQ rights. And this is something which comes up with those who've never spoken to or interviewed a queer Palestinian activist, I would note. Fraser Nelson, I mentioned him, this right-wing journalist here in Britain, and he said, Israel is this model of diversity, which is quite a grotesque thing to say about a state which practices apartheid. But in any case, and he said, they had a trans winner back in 1999. And a big part of Eurovision is what people call pinkwashing. It's weaponizing and using, and I say this as an LGBTQ person, the question of LGBTQ rights to justify apartheid and genocide. Obviously, queer Palestinians in Gaza are being slaughtered by Israeli weapons and left starving, their loved ones murdered, and all the rest. What do you say when people say about that argument about LGBTQ rights, which comes up all the time? What do you say in response? Because Eurovision is so entangled with queer culture.
Indeed, and of course, what Israel does here is a very cynical form of pinkwashing, which is, for anyone who doesn't know, it's whitewashing, it's covering up, but using queer and trans rights. It's called pinkwashing. Some corporations can indulge in it, and so on. Israel does it in this deeply cynical way that now is frankly genocidal too. The way that this is used to cover up and obscure and try to get people to move on from genocide in Gaza, even though it's still ongoing. We're going to see increased attempts, I think, to try to rehabilitate Israel now that this so-called ceasefire that doesn't exist is supposedly in place. We're going to see how these rehabilitation attempts grow, and pinkwashing is going to be part of that. In the context of Eurovision, this is very important, as you mentioned. The fact that Israel makes this argument is utterly hollow. Utterly hollow. Israel's bombs against 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza do not discriminate against people on the basis of their sexuality or their gender. There is no escape for Palestinians in Gaza, regardless of their orientation. So it's utterly cynical. We could talk about this for a long time, but I think it's important for Palestinian queer and trans groups who speak in their own words to be really heard on this. So I would encourage anyone listening to go and seek out such groups. I mean, one important annual event that I would mention is Queer Cinema for Palestine, which takes place in dozens, I think, of cities all over the world, and every year features a program of many queer and trans Palestinian stories. I would look up Queer Cinema for Palestine. I would look out for its announcement for next year and host such an event. I would invite queer and trans Palestinians to speak at your events. This is essential, I think, for countering this very cynical form of pinkwashing.
Just want to finally as always, just before we wrap up, what next? What can people do? What would you, in those countries where, like Britain, where participation is ongoing, what can people do?
I think that we should be, as Eurovision as of today is more than 5 months away. We have time to continue thinking very deeply about what the best type of strategy and tactics are here. What I would like to see is screening parties, for example, cancelled and replaced with alternative genocide-free Eurovision parties, if people want to host them. I think that we should figure out how to best appeal to and pressure not just the broadcasters, but as I mentioned, the contestants too, also presenters and commentators. If crew are, if TV workers basically are able to refuse to work on Eurovision without, undue harm to their careers, to their livelihoods, then I think they should do their best to also boycott Eurovision. Basically, we should be looking at every level and every stage of how this utterly tarnished and complicit contest by its organizers and by Israel's participation can be pressured to finally do the bare minimum and drop this genocidal state.
Amen to that. I'd also recommend, just finally, by the way, if anyone wants to look up, for example, queer Palestinian artists who are obviously advocating boycott. Bashar Murad is an example. I was in Palestine in September, and I met Bashar Murad. I interviewed him years ago about the question of pinkwashing. I would just implore people, listen to queer Palestinians. Queer Palestinians are out there demanding the boycott of Eurovision, and to not allow genocide and apartheid and colonialism to be pinkwashed. There's nothing more grotesque to me an LGBTQ person than my existence and my rights being used to justify the crime of crimes, which is, of course, genocide. But for those watching, share this video, get the message out. Please like and subscribe with your thoughts and your comments. I just want to say, as ever, a special thanks to Samir.
Thanks, Samir. Take care.